The Legislature Today show continues on 550 Cape Fire, the voice of the Northern Plains, and our affiliates AM 1100 The Flag Fargo and AM Talk Radio 1090 The Flag in the Bakken. And now back to the program with your host, Dale Wetzel, managing editor of Great Plains News and the Great Plains Examiner, covering his 14th North Dakota legislative session.
This is the Legislature Today. We're coming to you from the Peacock Alley American Bar and Grill in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. This is the second half hour on Thursday when we, by tradition, it's a short tradition, but nevertheless a tradition, we speak to the president of the Greater North Dakota Chamber of Commerce, a gentleman by the name of Andy Peterson, who's with us this evening, and he's got a pullover on from the Bully Pulpit Golf Course in southwestern North Dakota, one of the finest sets of links that you will find in this great wide world of ours. And I wanted to the first question I wanted to ask you, Andy, is when do you think that the legislature is going to end? Are you optimistic that we're going to make it in 80 days?
You know, I think they're going to have to do a couple of things. They might have to do some conference committees without gaveling in so they can get some extra time. There's so much that has gone to conference committee that I don't know that they can physically get it done right now. Dale, as you know, you have legislative management and all the attachments and amendments and whatnot have got to be put on and managed somehow. I don't know how you get it done in 80 days. I think legislatures by nature tend to be last-minute operations, but we've pushed so much water down the stream that, wow, I don't know how you get it done.
Well, one of the things that's a big holdup and a big reason for these, there's more than 100 conference committees, is because there is no agreement about how much to pay state employees.
Right.
How do you think that's going to shake out?
Well, at the end of the day, I think state employees will get between 3 and 5% increases overall. One side, of course, looks at it as that's too much, others too little. Of course, all the special interests then come in. So that's one of the arguments that's got to be tackled. So, Dale, at this point, I can't predict a whole lot other than I think they will get a raise, and it will be something that the rest of us look at and go, that's okay.
Well, another element here is to what extent, if any, there are going to be additional contributions to the state employee pension fund.
Yeah.
And there's a fairly stark difference between the Senate and House. The House does not want to put any more money into the state employee pension fund, and the Senate does.
Sure.
And that's quite a stark philosophical difference, frankly. And how do you think that will be resolved?
I think at the end of the day there'll be a small amount put into the pension fund. We'll push the problem down the road a little bit. What I'm really excited about when it comes to the pension fund, Dale, is that we might actually get to a real study. The actuary numbers that we deal with are from that of the pension fund itself. So there's no independent fund, and the taxpayers and those in charge really don't know how big or how small the problem is. And I think it's time that we find out from an independent actuary what the real problem is so that we can address it in a real way. What we do know is that it's probably not sustainable in its current form. And for a while we can get by with it. The stock market is doing better, those kinds of things. But when I look at the projections that their actuary talks about making, 8% on their money, 8%, I want to invest my money there if that person is really accurate. I don't know about you, Dale, but I'm not making 8% on my 401k money. It just doesn't happen. So that's the kind of thing that we really have to have real information on. And I think the real answer comes between this session and the next session, really getting into a real study to figure out where this system is.
I guess I'd like you to elaborate a bit on what you mean by a real study. Do you not trust the pension funds have actuaries working for them, and
no, we don't trust them.
Okay.
Plain and simple, it's their people. And again, I mentioned that figure of 8%. That's their figure, not an independent actuary's figure. I think we need some independent information out there that really tells us where they're at.
And what do you think is the ultimate way to solve this problem?
I think ultimately the way to solve the problem is to figure out how to shore this system up for those people that are in the system already. We've made them a promise. You come to work for us and we will give you this in exchange for that. I don't think you can go back and say to those people, listen, you've been in the system for 5 years and so you're no longer eligible. I think you have to, at a certain point, say all new hires are now on a 401 type system, or a defined contribution versus a defined benefit system. And then you have to go forward with that and shore up the system so that those who've worked for it get it. I think that's fair. I think that's honest. I think that's just. But I think in the future, we have to change the systems. Look at these private companies. Large companies have looked at theirs right here in town, Montana, Dakota, or MDU Resources, rather, made a change many years ago. They saw that the system was unsustainable, and so they made it change to do exactly what I just talked about. And it's now working for them, and people understand that it's working for them, and that they're not lacking for employees. Obviously, I mean, like the rest of us, they want to get the right people in, and there's some challenges there. But overall, the system is now healthy and sustainable for the long haul.
As you observe what the legislature is doing with the budget in terms of raising or cutting taxes, increasing spending, and right now, I mean, at the beginning of last week, we were $700 million out of balance.
Right.
We just had the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee on a moment ago, and he said that right now it's $1 billion out of balance. As we come to the end, which do you think is going to be sacrificed? Are the tax cuts going to be smaller, or are there going to be less spending increases?
Dale, as you remember early on, we called for a 1/3 cut in individual and business taxes and 1/3 cut in property taxes. We were unsure of the vehicles that might be used at that point. I think it's going to be significantly less than that. And I think that's unfortunate because, you know, everyone's getting something out of this session. If we're $1 billion upside down, a lot of people are getting some kind of appropriation for some reason that fits their interest. But the folks that are being overlooked are really the taxpayers. And if they can't get the spending in line, that means that tax reform and tax relief will take second fiddle to spending. And to answer your question directly, I think those folks will experience less. Now, again, I think that the legislature may be far enough away from the Measure 2 fight. They're no longer thinking about what happened in Measure 2. But at the end of the day, you know, we have this initiative process in North Dakota, and I don't think people will stand by seeing the state have a very large surplus at this point and a projected, you know, in the near future, meaning 5 to 6 years, a very bright future for our state. I don't think that people will stand by and say it's okay if they spend all the money and we don't get any tax relief. I think we'll see something happen at the ballot box as a result of that.
What sort of property tax strategy do you think the legislature is going to end up adopting? Right now we have an amalgam of approaches. We have a proposal to give you a credit on your income tax if you pay property tax. We have the mill levy buy down, which is essentially the subsidization of property taxes at the school district level. And we have a across-the-board property tax reduction depending on how much you pay. And these are all competing proposals. And plus we have the governor's education bill, which in itself has a property tax relief kind of built in. How does one resolve all of these competing things?
Sure. I think it's a fair question. And I think what we should never underestimate the power of the governor's chair. He came out early on and said, this is what I like. And, you know, Jack's a smart guy. He's thoughtful, and he did think through this approach. I think that comes through in a very large way. I think that is the bulk of what we might get as tax relief for property. I think there might be some accumulation or some mixing together of the other processes, but I think it might even be a week too early to talk about what comes out of those pieces. But if I was going to predict tonight, I would say the governor's plan comes out very strong, and I think the others follow in some sort of mixed fashion.
And how much in reserve are we going to have when it all is said and done? We have the House Majority Leader saying essentially that the Strategic Investments and Improvements Fund, which is one of the big savings accounts of state government, is basically gone, and that is $800 million or more. We have the Budget Stabilization Fund, which is right now approximately a $660 million fund. And the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee was on a moment ago and said one of the options is to make that fund smaller.
Sure. Yeah, some of those funds don't need to be as large as they are. You could take out $300,000 from the stabilization, the first fund we talked about. You could take some money out of the Budget Stabilization Fund. but also know that we have a very bright future in North Dakota. And as oil revenues increase, and they are increasing, it's seemingly almost daily, those funds will be reloaded. So while we may say, yeah, we don't have any money, there's a lot of money stuffed in one of 6 different funds. 3 of them are constitutional and 3 are statutory. So they can certainly mess around with the statutory ones. The constitutional ones are a little more difficult to get at.
Do you think that there's less enthusiasm for income tax cuts, both for individuals and corporations, than there was at the beginning of the session?
I think you're right. I think there is less appetite for that. I think legislators, and we all live in our own little world, you and I certainly have our own perspectives and our own little worlds as well, but they say, well, we're not hearing from folks about that. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a lot of public appetite for it. I think there's a lesser legislative appetite for it, especially as the spending pieces are so visible to them at this time.
Do you think that this legislature is going to end up spending way too much money?
We've always said that we like one-time spending, infrastructure, these kinds of things. We like that kind of thing. But it seems to me that there are a lot of needs that have been presented, some of them exaggerated, some of them are very real. But at the end of the day, what we hear around the state is the need is great, the need is great, the need is great. Everyone seems to present that kind of thing. And so I think that government will expand. It's got to expand in some ways. I think we may spend a little more money than we anticipated. It's easy to have that kind of group process.
When you said that some needs are exaggerated, what were you thinking of?
Think of the stories up in the oil patch. Certainly there are needs, and I do not want to minimize that in any way, shape, or form. But I do think from time to time we hear stories about, there's not enough cops up there, there's not enough sheriff, there's not enough jails, there's not enough this or that. And certainly all of those things are stressed. But I think if you expand some of those things too much, there's a balance, and we have to figure out what that is. And I will be the first to admit, I think there's more art than science in figuring out what the right number and of course, quantity of those kinds of things are.
What sort of issues do you think that have nothing to do with the budget, well, at least they're tangentially related to it, that might hold things up in terms of adjournment? I'm thinking specifically about the drunken driving bill, because there was a lot of hoopla about that at the beginning of the session. Right now, it's something that I think it's fair to say it is much less stringent against drunken drivers, particularly first-time ones, than the original bill was. And I'm wondering to what extent there's going to be a public backlash about that.
I think the public saw that, and certainly the day that they brought that car in, that the family died in, that was a very impactful day. I remember looking at that car. I couldn't even tell you what kind it was until someone told me what kind it was or what brand it was. And I think at that point there was this proposal to have 30 days in jail on your first offense. And now, of course, as you mentioned, it's been watered down a little bit. So we've gone from one extreme to the other. That one may have to come back a little bit. I was a little taken back when I saw 30 days in jail. If you look at states around us, Minnesota, for instance, you will be jailed if you're pulled over for drunken driving. But until you can see the judge and he can, of course, go through the process with whomever that person is, and if you get picked up on a Friday evening, you're sitting there till Monday morning. A month to me was way too stringent. So I think in that particular case, we went a little too far, and now we've gone too far back the other way. Hopefully that'll swing back in the middle. I don't think at the end of the day, though, that will hold up the legislature. I think they'll come to an agreement on that. I think issues of taxes, budget, higher education, I think will be something that will be fought over till the last dog is hung, those kinds of things.
Do you think that the legislature has, well, let me back up a moment. At the beginning of the session, the chairman of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Richard McLeod, came and made a speech to a joint session and said, we would like you to help us share in the state's prosperity. And one of the things that was mentioned was the availability of job training grants for tribal community colleges. Now that has been approved. Sure. At the amount of $5 million, and I spoke to the the community college presidents, and they're quite pleased with that.
Right. As they should be.
The question I have for you, do you think that the state legislature has done enough along those lines to try to bring the Indian reservations along in terms of job training and just general assistance to try to increase their to ameliorate their lot?
I think, Dale, to the best of their ability, the legislature has done what they can. That doesn't mean that the legislature is all-knowing or is in control of everything that's happening. I think to the best of their ability, in this case, they've done what they can, and I don't know what else they can do. Now, that may be ignorance on my part or ignorance on the part of the legislature itself, but I think, again, to the best of their ability, they have.
Did the Chamber of Commerce have any particular agenda when it came to aid to the Indian reservations?
No, we haven't had a stance on that. We've always been concerned with it, but again, sometimes lack of involvement on our part or their part hasn't led to any kind of common understanding. So we haven't really had any huge expectations in that department. One
of the issues that got banged around quite a bit was, what should we do with the Board of Higher Education? Should we get rid of it? Should we restructure it? Should we, flog them at sunrise or whatever? One of the and the last constitutional amendment proposal that would have abolished the Board of Higher Education was effectively dealt with today. It would have essentially had created a 3-member higher education commission that would run the university system. Essentially, you would have a 3-headed chancellor.
Sure.
And without a Board of Higher Education behind him. And what I was wanting to ask you is, did the chamber have any particular favorite in terms of a proposal to restructure higher education in North Dakota, or were you kind of neutral on this question?
We were a little bit, we were neutral on this situation, but let me just say this. I don't care what kind of governance structure is behind a leader or leaders. It really is up to that leadership to make that work and to make it work effectively. And I think perhaps the makeup of the legislature, the past bad blood, perhaps the new chancellor and his approach, he's a pretty strong-headed character. That has led to these fights in my mind. We've stayed out of them. We are a little astonished that they've gotten the kind of increases that they've gotten given, the fight that's gone on. And as far as governorship or governance, if I can get that out, I think at the end of the day, if something like that went to the ballot, I don't know that the people would approve it. I think the people are pretty protective of higher ed, want to see it work, and are frustrated with the fights.
One of the fascinating things that I've observed, and I'd like your reaction to this, is that there are a few state agencies that get groused about more than the higher education and the university system. But at the end of the day, they get more money, they get more power, they get more buildings, they're allowed to raise the tuition. And I'm just wondering, so now when someone grouses about the Board of Higher Education, I've heard this for so many years that I'm thinking, yeah, fine. You're complaining about the Board of Higher Education, but at the end of the day, you're going to do diddly squat about it. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's, first of all, do we need to do something about? I mean, is the governance? You kind of address this, but is the governance structure as good as it could be? I'm not necessarily defending the idea of a 3-member commission, but I'm wondering if some other structure might be a better job.
I don't know that the governance structure is as good as it could be. But that doesn't excuse leadership from making this thing work and making it work well. We have an opportunity in North Dakota. We have plenty of money. We've talked about that. And we've given more money to the university system this year in a way that is pretty meaningful, more than any state agency. So, governance is what it is. I think we have got to get some real leadership, and the people really need to call that leadership to accountability to make it work.
You've observed the new legislators. Who do you think is an up-and-comer?
That's a great question. I look at Max Schneider. I think Max Schneider on the Democratic side is a real up-and-comer. I think there are a few others on that side of the aisle that want to be up-and-comers. But he's a thoughtful, intentional. He's always looking for the next fight he can win or the next battle that he can win versus what he might have lost last week. So I think when it comes to leadership, in my mind, that's a great quality. I think on the Republican side, certainly a lot of people have shown their different colors. I think there are some great young people that have come into the session this time.
I'm interested in your impression of some of them.
Well, Kylie Overson from Grand Forks, a young woman, bright, smart, articulate, able to communicate well, has kind of learned, I don't want to say learned her role because she's a freshman, but certainly is taking the time to figure out how the legislature works and yet at the same time has an opinion. I think there are some on the Republican side that are either freshmen or sophomores that are coming along. I look at Ole Larson, who came in really kind of roughshod last session and has matured this time and has been put in the Human Service Committee. Probably not the one he would choose, but at the end of the day has become a leader, learned how to compromise. Those are the kind of people I think that we should be grateful are spending time here in Bismarck.
Do you think that, how would you evaluate the legislature as a whole in terms of intellectual horsepower?
You know, I think we certainly have got some extremely smart folks, and we have different folks with different skills. If you look at Representative Carlson, he certainly is pretty good at keeping his majority together, moving in a direction. And if you look at Majority Leader Wardner, there's a man in my mind who is extremely intelligent, very thoughtful, still on a learning curve. I mean, it's been steep, it's been fast for him and all those kinds of things. And yes, he is a veteran, but it's a whole new role for him. So I think two different leadership styles there. I think there are some very, very thoughtful and smart people in the legislature. Tony Grinberg from Fargo, veteran, seasoned, thoughtful, deliberative, in many ways kind of a leader but not being the leader in some ways. So there's lots of different personalities there, and I think as we deal with them one-on-one, we find different skills that they have. Robin Wise is a great example. A Republican in the House Human Services Committee. And the House, as we both know, is a little more conservative. And yet at the same time, Robin is very good at handling those kinds of issues that are thorny, sometimes controversial, with a conservative group of colleagues. And he's very, very skilled at what he's done there.
How do you think that the legislature is going to end? Well, let me put it this way. Do you think that there is a plan in the Republican majority right now as we're talking today? Is there a plan to end the session?
You know, I wish I could say that there
because
was.
I don't think there is one.
I might agree with you in this case. I think it's getting a little rough and tumble at this point. Certain people want to get certain things through. Mr. Scarpole, for instance, has got his bill and others that he's trying to work in his area for. But I think it could be a bit of a brawl the last 10 days or so. Because
it's just my personal opinion, but there are so many things that have not been closed down. There are so many balls in the air, and of course that is common to some extent.
Right.
But I don't get the impression that there is an end game in mind at this point.
There's not a master plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've been speaking to Andy Peterson, who is the president of the Greater North Dakota Chamber of Commerce. We have Mr. Peterson on the show on Thursday nights to basically talk about the legislature and things that are going on. And sometimes he brings the organization's lobbyist, Mr. Bill Shalhoub, with him. But tonight he's flying solo, and I must say, I mentioned this earlier, he's looking very spiffy. He's got a golf Bully Pulpit golf course pullover on, and it looks very, very attractive. I'm going to have to get one of those. We've been talking about the budget, and right now we're coming into day 70 of the legislative session, and the rule of thumb is 2 weeks before the last conference committee is appointed, so we have 10 more days to get it done, and boy, it looks grim right now. This is Dale Wetzel at the Legislature Today.
The Legislature Today is brought to you in part by Prairie